Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about MongoDB and when to use it and when not to use it. So let's get into it. Basically, the question in question here was, well, there was a bit of a backstory here because this person kind of reached out and said that from his perspective that he has started with the MERN stack in order to learn how to do like full stack development, which is a very common choice in people who are self-taught or like who are starting out these days. But he had a bit of a concern because there's quite a lot of people on different forums like Stack Overflow and so forth that express a lot of frustration with MongoDB and that it's not a really good, no, it's not a great database and they have issues and stuff like that, right? And so basically he wanted me to elaborate a little bit on why that is. Why is there such a negativity connected to Mongo? And I think I can answer that. It's of course hard to know exactly what the people, without any details on as to what the comments that he read was about, but his general sensation was that MongoDB gets a lot of hatred. And I will say that to a point that is absolutely true. MongoDB has a lot of naysayers who blame it for a range of different different reasons. But I will say that I think that this is a case of well, I don't want to be that guy, but I think that the people who are bash talking Mongo either have a use case that is very specific for some reason, or more likely they're simply misusing it. Because the thing is that most of the people that I see who are really complaining about MongoDB and talk about relational databases as this great thing that is much more useful, I've never ever talked to anybody who has had an issue with Mongo that didn't boil down to one of two things. And that is that there's no schema in MongoDB, or that they would need a way of expressing relationships in some fashion. And if you have that problem, I feel that this is not Mongo's fault. I don't feel that this is a technological issue. I think that this is you. I think you are the problem here. I think that the person who decided to go with MongoDB made they didn't do their homework. It's such a classic example. I have the same problem with people who bash talk JavaScript. There's tons of people who hate on JavaScript, not because the language is bad, but because they blame the language for their own lack of skill. It comes down to that. I've never ever met someone who is a true master of JavaScript who has a problem with it. But the people who complain, they usually suck at it. And I think that this is the same sort of thing. Because the thing is, if you don't understand your data storage needs and you go just arbitrarily with MongoDB because it's quick and easy, then you have made an ad hoc decision. That's fine, but don't blame MongoDB for that decision, because it's not the database fault that you don't understand your own use case, because MongoDB has a very specific, very useful situation, or a very useful use case when you understand that use case. I will touch on it, but I feel it's a little bit unfair that you discover, because seems to be the problem, that a lot of companies discover as they go along, that they may have found that MongoDB was a very good fit for their problem at the start of things. Then their problem evolves into something more complicated and MongoDB can't accommodate it, and now it's the fault of the database. I think that that's kind of weird. I mean, you don't see people blaming Redis for not having the ability to create a join, or blaming Redis for not having the same sort of capacity as a relational database. The reason is very simple, because people know what the use case for Redis truly is, and the use case for Redis is usually not something that's going to evolve into something more complicated. And that's the thing here. It's this deception that some people it's the deceptive nature of making an arbitrary decision between a document database and a relational database. If you start out with a document database, you need to know what the limitations are. And some of those limitations are going to stick with you. You can bridge them. There are ways for you to just accommodate that, and I know this for a fact, that you can bridge the limitation of not having relationships in MongoDB. It's not that complicated to do. But some people really get frustrated that they don't have that same capacity. and all they needed to know was how to think about it. So I'll give you an example of when I think that MongoDB is a very good fit. So when you are working on a project or you have a data model that you can express as a single document, this is when MongoDB is truly useful. Examples of this is, let's say that you have a blog of some sort, because the thing is, if you make say a blog in Angular or React or an SPA or whatever, usually what you want is to show an entire page where all of the data is there, like the images, the comments, like all of this stuff. And what's beautiful about that is that that can actually be expressed as a single JSON file, one big JSON blob of data that you can just send to the client and show the entire page in one go. That is a very good example of when MongoDB makes a lot of sense, because the thing is that it's just JSON and you just want to store it as one big entity of information. You don't really need to express a relationship here. There's not a bunch of complicated models that need to be connected to each other, and you don't really need to enforce a schema of some sort, because it's very unlikely that you will get this sort of thing wrong. This is a very useful situation for MongoDB. It's going to do that job very, very well. And in my own tutorials, I use MongoDB quite often, because for these sorts of cases where you don't really have an all that complicated domain model, it's a very simple and quick way of solving that problem. So when you don't have a stable model, or it's ideally a model that is very simple to express, and you can basically push and get data or persist and get data from the database in one single query, then MongoDB is a perfect choice. However, that's usually not the case for more advanced use cases. It's usually the case that a system may start out as something like that, like a simple domain of some sort, and then it evolves, and you start getting the need to express relationships between various entities. You may have, as an example, you may have a web shop. Now, a web shop may not be the best scenario to keep or like to have MongoDB for, because in a web shop you have things such as payments, and a payment may be connected to an order, and an order may be connected to several items, and these items are connected to suppliers, so that an order is also connected to a user of some sort. And all of these various things, like these models that you need to have in your system, they boil down to relationships. Now, if you wanted to model this in MongoDB, what you would have to do would be to basically put the ID of each of these entities that are connected to each other on the various connection entities, like the order, as an example, would have to keep a list of all the IDs, or the vice versa. The products would have to keep a reference to the order, whichever way you pick to go. But it's probably better to have the order have a list of IDs. And then this order would have to basically loop through, or do a mass query. First, you would have to get the order first, and then you could make a second call to actually get all of the products, because you can't do a join. You can't just connect it to the data response that you get from Mongo. So a lot of people would find that to be a bit of a limitation, and I can agree. Sure, that is a limitation, but as I said, the trade-offs here are already there. You should have done your research before you do this sort of investment. If you don't understand these things, I don't think it's fair to say that it's Mongo that is to be blamed here. And so I would say that if you have this use case, if you have a more sophisticated use case than just basically JSON storage, then you should consider having a relational database. Apart from that, the only criticism that I can feel is accurate is the fact that there's a lack of a schema in MongoDB. And that is, I will agree that it's very, for me, that's kind of like some people criticizing JavaScript or TypeScript. They don't like TypeScript or a type system in general, because they feel like types are restrictive and they don't give as much flexibility as a loosely typed solution. And for me, this feels kind of like the same thing, because there are situations when I'm working on something fairly simple where I don't really care so much about enforcing like a table layout of some sort with where I need to enforce a specific schema when I'm working. That's usually for private projects or smaller projects, but for larger projects with more sophisticated models, I kind of always want that, because I've had a few scenarios where it's not that uncommon that somebody runs some faulty code somewhere and by mistake they inject records into a collection in Mongo that isn't in line with everything else. And that's the thing that is important to remember here. Since Mongo doesn't have a schema system that is enforced, you can basically, and this is very common that this happens, you can put any document into any collection virtually. In other words, you don't have any you can't trust that when you inject a piece of data that Mongo, the database will say, hey, you're trying to, I don't know, put a user in the order collection, which means that when you're in theory retrieving, when you're retrieving records, you might have created an inconsistency in your data. So you can have two orders that may be from various times in various periods in time for your products. You might have involuntarily created a situation where you might have an order that has a few fields and then another order has different fields, which creates this problem when you want to serialize things. And that's a whole different discussion on what problem that causes. But basically, if you can the thing that you can think about here is that if this happens, you have an inconsistency in your records, you can basically, it's a bug waiting to happen or a system crash waiting to happen. So that's a criticism that I will abide by, and I will accept. But as I said, I think that it's still a matter of not understanding the use case here, because if you have stable, complicated models or models that need to have this level of enforcement, like they are fairly complex, for these sorts of more serious projects, I think that the relational database is a better choice. And I don't think it's fair to blame Mongo for that. It's a different use case in my world. So what I want you to take away from this is basically that there is a certain level of hatred and resentment towards MongoDB, but I don't think that is all that. It's not fair, because MongoDB has a use case. It comes down to understanding that use case. It's similar to, I mean, if you don't get angry with a hammer for not being able to do the job of a saw. If you use it for the right thing, it's a perfect fit. And it's as I said, in my world, it's a very similar thing to people getting angry at JavaScript for their own lack of understanding. And that's exactly how I feel about this criticism towards Mongo. So use Mongo when you have a fairly simple data model. You can input and extract a single record pretty much with one query. You don't need to express relationships or anything like that. You can just dump a bunch of JSON into a document or something like that. That's a very good use case. Not such a good use case is if you have complicated relationships and different models that needs to have connections to each other, or you for some reason really need to enforce a schema layout of some sort. That's not the best use case for MongoDB, at least not in my opinion. Have a great day.